Welcome back to Sleepy Science. Tonight, we invite you to settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and drift into the quiet logic and gentle irony of the universe's most quietly persistent truths. In this series, we explore the strange and wonderful laws of life, those curious observations that aren't quite scientific theorems, yet seem to govern reality with uncanny accuracy. From Murphy's Law to Hofstadter's paradoxes, these aren't just quirky sayings, they reflect the hidden rhythms of human behavior, decision-making, and our constant attempts to predict the unpredictable. If you enjoy learning about science, systems, and the strange sense of humor embedded in the real world, don't forget to subscribe, gently tap the notification bell, and join us as we unravel logic with a soft voice and a slower heartbeat. Now, breathe in, and let's begin. Murphy's Law is perhaps one of the most widely recognized adages in the modern world, embodying a kind of fatalistic humor about the nature of things going wrong. The phrase, "If something can go wrong, it will," has become a universal shorthand for the inevitability of failure in complex systems, the unreliability of human planning, and the endless surprises of life itself. But despite its simple structure and popular usage, the origins, interpretations, and scientific resonance of Murphy's Law are rich with nuance and cultural significance. The law's origins are frequently traced back to Edward A. Murphy, Jr., an American aerospace engineer working in the late 1940s. The story most commonly associated with the phrase took place in 1949 during an experiment at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The purpose of the experiment, part of the U.S. First Air Force's MX-981 project, was to test the effects of rapid deceleration on the human body. The project involved strapping a human subject, frequently Colonel John Stapp, into a rocket-powered sled that would accelerate down a track and then come to a sudden stop. The goal was to better understand the limits of human endurance in high-speed aircraft and to develop improved safety harnesses and restraints. During one test, a set of sensors meant to measure acceleration forces was installed incorrectly. Murphy, who had designed the sensor setup, allegedly blamed the technician who wired it, saying something along the lines of, "If there's any way to do it wrong, he'll find it." This phrase, while not identical to the modern wording of the law, contains its essence. According to later accounts, particularly those by John Stapp, the phrase was then paraphrased into, "If anything can go wrong, it will," and began to circulate among the team. Stapp, who appreciated the cautionary value of the sentiment, later told reporters that Murphy's Law should be seen as a reminder to design systems that anticipate error, rather than as a cynical prediction of doom. Despite its gloomy phrasing, in the engineering world, it became a rallying cry for robustness, redundancy, and error-proofing. Over time, Murphy's Law escaped the confines of aerospace and engineering and became part of popular culture. By the 1950s and 60s, it was appearing in magazines, newspapers, and eventually books. It was adopted not just by engineers but by comedians, office workers, project managers, and anyone who had ever experienced an unforeseen disaster. Part of the appeal of Murphy's Law lies in its universality. Whether you are baking a cake, writing code, or building a rocket, things will go wrong, and usually at the worst possible time. In this sense, Murphy's Law resonates as a kind of secular proverb, a distilled piece of folk wisdom about the fallibility of human plans and the unpredictability of complex systems. From a scientific perspective, Murphy's Law is not a law in the traditional sense. It's not derived from controlled experiments or framed in mathematical language like Newton's laws or the laws of thermodynamics. Rather, it is a psychological and probabilistic observation dressed up as a deterministic rule. However, there are ways in which Murphy's Law aligns with certain principles in physics, mathematics, and system theory. One such parallel is with the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy, the measure of disorder in a system, tends to increase over time in a closed system. In a poetic sense, Murphy's Law could be interpreted as the lived experience of entropy. Systems, left to themselves, tend toward chaos unless energy, planning, and attention are applied to keep them orderly. In other words, it's not that the universe is malevolent, it's just indifferent, and without intentional effort, disorder prevails. Another way to frame Murphy's Law is through probability. In any sufficiently complex system, the number of things that can go wrong far outweighs the number of things that can go right. This means that unless each potential failure is anticipated and guarded against, the odds of a problem arising become significant. This is especially true in systems with tight coupling, where one component's failure cascades quickly into the failure of the whole. This is why engineers and safety designers must assume that failure is not only possible, but inevitable unless specifically designed against. Murphy's Law also ties into several cognitive biases. One such bias is the negativity bias, our psychological tendency to focus more on negative events than positive ones. When something goes wrong, we notice it and remember it more vividly than when everything goes right. This makes Murphy's Law feel truer than it statistically might be. Related is the availability heuristic. We judge the likelihood of events based on how easily we can recall examples. Because failed outcomes tend to be more memorable, the plane that crashed, not the thousands that didn't, we may overestimate the frequency of things going wrong. This psychological reinforcement loop keeps Murphy's Law alive in our minds and conversations. Interestingly, there have been tongue-in-cheek scientific studies attempting to test Murphy's Law. One of the most famous of these is the buttered toast phenomenon, the idea that a dropped slice of toast tends to land butter side down. Physicists and mathematicians have analyzed the dynamics of toast falling from tables and found that, because of the average height of a table and the rotation rate of a falling slice of toast, it often only has time to rotate once and a half, landing butter side down. It turns out that the geometry of everyday life conspires to confirm Murphy's Law, at least in this trivial case. In the world of engineering, Murphy's Law is often treated not as a joke, but as a design principle. The idea of error-proofing or fail-safe design, sometimes called poka-yoke in manufacturing, is essentially an applied response to Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, the system must be built in a way that it either prevents that from happening or fails in a safe and controlled manner. This philosophy has influenced everything from airplane cockpits to hospital checklists to software user interfaces. In this sense, Murphy's Law has saved lives by serving as a reminder to anticipate failure and design accordingly. Murphy's Law has also inspired a whole family of similar adages, often called Murphyisms or extensions of Murphy's Law. These include Finagle's Law, anything that can go wrong will at the worst possible moment, the Peter Principle. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence. And Parkinson's Law, work expands to fill the time available for its completion. Together, these form a kind of informal canon of organizational pessimism and operational realism, a set of rules of thumb that reflect how systems and people often behave under pressure. Real-life examples of Murphy's Law in action are everywhere. In space exploration, the Apollo 13 mission is a dramatic illustration. A seemingly minor defect, a damaged oxygen tank, led to a cascading series of problems that nearly cost the lives of 3 astronauts. The survival of the crew is widely regarded as a triumph of engineering problem-solving under Murphy's Law conditions. In medicine, surgical errors or dosage mistakes can occur because a system allowed for human error to go uncorrected, a classic setup for Murphy's Law. In software development, a programmer may fix one bug only to create 2 more, as changes ripple through interdependent systems. In daily life, we see it when we spill coffee on the only copy of an important document, when the printer jams just before a deadline, or when traffic appears only when we're running late. Murphy's Law has permeated culture to the point that it appears in movies, literature, military training manuals, and corporate handbooks. Its enduring appeal lies not just in its grim humor, but in its reminder of human fallibility. We are imperfect beings trying to build and navigate imperfect systems in an unpredictable world. Murphy's Law is not just a joke, it's a challenge. To prepare better, design smarter, expect the unexpected, and keep a sense of humor when, inevitably, something goes wrong. Sod's Law is a well-known expression of pessimism and irony, closely related in spirit to Murphy's Law, yet with a uniquely British character and cultural flavor. The basic phrasing, "any system that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood," reveals a deeper insight into the frailty of human communication, system design, and perception. Though often used humorously or sarcastically, Sod's Law points toward a profound and persistent truth about how people interact with systems, instructions, and one another. Misunderstandings are not only possible, but frequently inevitable. Despite its similarity to Murphy's Law, Sod's Law has its own identity and historical background. Unlike Murphy's Law, which has traceable roots in American aerospace engineering in the late 1940s, Sod's Law emerged more as a piece of British folk wisdom. Its precise origin is difficult to pin down, largely because it evolved organically from colloquial sayings and social humor rather than from a singular scientific context. The term sod itself is British slang, a mild curse word, often used in frustration, that expresses a sort of resigned exasperation at bad luck, incompetence, or unfortunate circumstance. Saying, "typical, just my luck," or Sod's Law, is roughly equivalent to sighing in disbelief when something that could go wrong inevitably does. Although there is no definitive person credited with coining Sod's Law, references to it began appearing in British media and common speech in the mid-20th century. It gained particular popularity in the post-war era, when bureaucracy, technology, and expanding government systems led to a rise in everyday frustrations with complexity and miscommunication. In this environment, Sod's Law functioned as a kind of sardonic shorthand for a widespread feeling that systems, whether designed by governments, companies, or well-meaning individuals, are more often misunderstood than correctly used or interpreted. The assumption isn't that people are stupid or that systems are always badly designed, though both may be true, but rather that the interaction between the two is ripe for confusion. The difference between Murphy's Law and Sod's Law can be subtle but important. Murphy's Law states that if something can go wrong, it will, and usually refers to mechanical failure, probability, or unexpected events in complex systems. Sod's Law, on the other hand, emphasizes misunderstanding, particularly in the realm of communication, procedure, and human interaction. While Murphy's Law might result in an engine failure or a computer crash, Sod's Law leads to someone pressing the wrong button, misreading the instructions, or showing up at the wrong location due to a poorly worded email. From a scientific or analytical point of view, Sod's law can be seen as a commentary on the limitations of human cognition and the challenges of information transfer. One major contributing concept is the signal-to-noise ratio, a term from information theory which quantifies how much useful information is transmitted compared to irrelevant or confusing data. In any real-world system, whether it's a computer interface, a traffic sign, or a scientific paper, there is always some level of noise, ambiguity, distraction, contradiction, or excess detail. The more noise, the greater the chance for misunderstanding. Sod's law, in this light, is an expression of what happens when the signal-to-noise ratio becomes too low for a clear message to survive. Another related scientific principle is the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy or disorder tends to increase in any closed system. While this law is about physical systems, it has been metaphorically applied to human systems as well. Over time, without intentional effort to clarify, maintain, and adapt, even the best designed systems become harder to understand. Instructions become outdated. Procedures accumulate exceptions. Technology outpaces documentation. People leave organizations, taking institutional knowledge with them. In such an environment, Sod's law is not only likely, it's inevitable. Cognitive science also provides fertile ground for understanding the phenomenon behind Sod's law. Human beings are not perfect processors of information. Our brains are full of cognitive shortcuts or heuristics, which help us make decisions quickly but not always accurately. One such heuristic is confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in a way that confirms existing beliefs. Another is availability bias, where people rely on examples that are most easily recalled rather than those that are most representative. These biases can lead people to interpret systems in unexpected or incorrect ways, even if the original design seemed clear to its creator. The curse of knowledge is another relevant concept. This refers to the difficulty experienced by experts in communicating ideas to non-experts, because they can't easily put themselves in the shoes of someone unfamiliar with the subject. When a software developer writes instructions for end users, for example, they might assume a level of understanding that most users simply don't have. The result? Misinterpretation, misuse, and frustration, all classic manifestations of Sod's law. Sod's law has countless real-world examples across domains. One common occurrence is in public signage. A sign that reads, "No parking on this side on Mondays," might seem clear to the person who wrote it, but to someone unfamiliar with the local regulations, the phrasing can be ambiguous. Which side is this side? Does on Mondays include midnight? Is it enforced on holidays? Such ambiguities can result in tickets, arguments, or unnecessary stress, not because the driver was trying to break the law, but because the sign was ripe for misinterpretation. Another fertile ground for Sod's law is user interface design. Consider a website with two buttons, submit and cancel. If they are placed too close together or not clearly labeled, a user might accidentally click cancel and lose all their data. This is not a failure of the system itself, but a failure of communication and expectation. It happens all the time in digital design. Unclear instructions, non-intuitive icons, or inconsistent user flows lead people to do the opposite of what was intended. Designers may blame the users, but Sod's law tells us that if something can be misread, misclicked, or misunderstood, it will be. In the legal and bureaucratic world, Sod's law appears in the form of fine print, convoluted procedures, or poorly explained forms. Tax documents, visa applications, insurance policies, all are fertile ground for misunderstanding. Even when instructions are technically correct, They are often written in language that assumes a high level of domain knowledge. The average person may interpret a clause or requirement incorrectly and face serious consequences. Again, the law or rule may be sound, but the delivery and interpretation of that rule become the weak link. Medical settings are another arena where Sod's law can have serious consequences. Miscommunication between doctors and patients or among medical staff can lead to errors in medication, dosage, or procedure. A doctor may say, "Take this medication twice a day," but a patient may interpret that as morning and night, when in fact, it means every 12 hours. In high-stakes environments like emergency rooms or surgical theaters, even small misunderstandings can become life-threatening. Recognizing the risk of Sod's law, many hospitals now implement standardized communication protocols like readbacks or checklists to minimize ambiguity. Educational environments also illustrate Sod's law. Teachers may explain a concept they find obvious, but students, especially from different cultural or linguistic backgrounds, may misinterpret key ideas. Instructions on an exam might be unclear, leading students to answer incorrectly even though they understood the material. These failures are not about intelligence, but about mismatched assumptions and imperfect communication. Perhaps the most relatable version of Sod's law appears in daily life. You send a group message saying, "Let's meet at the usual place," assuming everyone knows where that is, only to find that one person interpreted it differently. Or you leave instructions for a friend feeding your cat while you're away, and they feed it double the amount because they misunderstood your notes. These are not dramatic failures, but they reveal a basic truth. If your message has more than one possible meaning, someone will probably choose the wrong one. Despite its pessimism, Sod's law is not just a punchline, it can be a tool for better design, communication, and collaboration. Recognizing that misunderstanding is a common and expected part of any system allows designers, educators, leaders, and engineers to take steps to minimize it. This may include using clearer language, redundancy, user testing, or feedback loops. Rather than blaming users for being confused, systems can be built to anticipate confusion and gently guide users toward the intended behavior. In conclusion, Sod's law expresses a fundamental insight into human systems. Ambiguity breeds error, and wherever there is room for confusion, confusion will flourish. It captures the tragicomedy of modern life, where the best laid plans are undone not by sabotage, but by a simple failure to understand. Whether in software design, public signage, education, healthcare, or everyday relationships, Sod's law reminds us that communication is hard, clarity is rare, and empathy is essential. Instead of fighting this truth, wise people and systems learn to work with it. They assume the possibility of misunderstanding not as a flaw, but as a constant, and they build with that in mind. Hofstadter's law is a deceptively simple statement. Everything takes longer than you think, even when you take Hofstadter's law into account. On its surface, it reads as a clever paradox, a kind of recursive joke aimed at project managers, programmers, and perfectionists. Yet beneath its humorous tone lies a profound psychological and cognitive insight about the way humans perceive time, estimate effort, and manage complexity. This law, first articulated by cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter in his 1979 book Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, has since become a kind of mantra in disciplines where planning and timing are critical and where delay seems almost inevitable. Douglas Hofstadter introduced the law in a discussion of artificial intelligence and problem solving, particularly in relation to the development of computer programs designed to mimic human reasoning. In that context, Hofstadter was reflecting on how difficult it is to anticipate how long it will take to build systems that truly capture the complexity of human thought. Even when experts tried to account for all possible complications and consciously adjusted their timelines to be more realistic, the project still ended up taking longer than expected. The law was born out of a pattern that repeated itself endlessly: underestimation followed by delay, regardless of preparation. The recursive nature of Hofstadter's law is part of what makes it both amusing and incisive. It's a law that builds in the failure of prediction even when the predictor knows the law exists. If you know that things will take longer than you think and adjust accordingly, they will still take longer than that. The humor masks a very real phenomenon. Human beings are notoriously poor at estimating how long tasks will take, especially when those tasks are complex, unfamiliar, or involve multiple stages and dependencies. Scientific and psychological research provides robust support for Hofstadter's insight. One of the main cognitive phenomena behind the law is the planning fallacy, a term coined by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979, the same year Hofstadter wrote his book. The planning fallacy refers to the tendency for individuals and groups to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits. This bias persists even when people are familiar with similar tasks and have prior experience. When asked to predict how long something will take, people tend to think in ideal scenarios, the best-case outcome where everything proceeds smoothly and no problems arise. But real life rarely matches this ideal path, leading to inevitable delays. The planning fallacy isn't just about optimism, it's rooted in how the brain processes information. Humans tend to focus on the specific task at hand and ignore outside factors that can affect completion time: interruptions, coordination with others, unexpected obstacles, fatigue, or even emotional states. This is known as focalism, where attention is narrowly focused on the internal aspects of a task, while the external world is discounted. Additionally, people often fail to look at distributional data, the actual time it took to complete similar tasks in the past, and instead rely on internal predictions, which are typically shorter. Another contributing factor to Hofstadter's law is complexity. Many tasks, particularly those involving creative work, coding, writing, or research, are not linear. They involve recursive problem-solving, frequent redefinition of goals, and dynamic learning as one progresses. In software development, for example, a small bug fix may uncover a deeper architectural issue. Writing a paper may lead to the realization that the argument needs a stronger foundation, which requires additional reading and research. The deeper one goes, the more hidden complexities emerge. Hofstadter's law is particularly applicable in these cases because it warns us that even our corrections for underestimation are themselves likely to be underestimated. There's also a phenomenon known as scope creep that tends to accompany complex projects. This occurs when the goals of a project slowly expand over time, usually without a corresponding increase in resources or time. A programmer starts by intending to build a simple feature, but soon realizes it would be more elegant to redesign the whole module. A writer starts a short blog post and ends up creating a book chapter. Each of these changes feels logical and valuable, but they also increase the time required to complete the task. Because these shifts feel incremental, people often fail to update their time estimates appropriately. Hofstadter's law captures this feature as well. Even if you're aware of how long things took in the past and try to correct for it, the recursive, expanding nature of projects can still surprise you. Real-life examples of Hofstadter's law abound. especially in fields that require careful planning or rely on deadlines. In construction, large infrastructure projects almost always take longer than projected. From the Sydney Opera House to Boston's Big Dig to Berlin's Brandenburg Airport, there are dozens of high-profile examples where optimistic timelines gave way to years, even decades, of delay. In software development, the phenomenon is so common that it inspired its own satirical rules, such as the 1990 rule. The first 90% of the code accounts for the first 90% of the development time. The remaining 10% of the code accounts for the other 90% of the development time. This directly echoes the spirit of Hofstadter's law. In academia, students consistently misjudge how long it will take to write papers or study for exams, despite having years of experience. Researchers underestimate how long it will take to collect data, analyze results, and revise manuscripts. Dissertation timelines are perhaps the most iconic example. A student plans to finish in 3 years, adjusts to 5, and still ends up defending in year 7. These aren't just failures of discipline or effort. They reflect a deep psychological blind spot about time and task management. In everyday life, the same pattern shows up in tasks as mundane as getting ready in the morning, cooking a meal, or commuting. You might know it takes 20 minutes to get to work, yet still find yourself running late because you forgot to factor in the time to find your keys or stop for gas. Or you begin cleaning your kitchen only to discover that the fridge needs defrosting and the sink is clogged, turning a 15-minute chore into a 3-hour ordeal. Hofstadter's law is not limited to the grand or the technical, it applies across scales. Despite its dark humor, Hofstadter's law is not without value or constructive use. It serves as a reminder to buffer time estimates generously, to anticipate the unknown, and to be wary of one's own cognitive biases. Some project managers now use techniques like reference class forecasting, where they base predictions on actual historical data from similar projects rather than internal expectations. Others use agile and iterative workflows to manage uncertainty, allowing for regular reassessment and adaptation. Furthermore, Hofstadter's law can be seen not just as a cautionary note, but also as a call for humility. It reminds us that the world is more complex than we often assume, that expertise doesn't guarantee perfect foresight, and that time is a variable we frequently fail to understand. In some ways, accepting the truth of Hofstadter's law can reduce frustration and blame. Instead of berating ourselves or others for delays, we can recognize that these are natural consequences of working with imperfect knowledge in an unpredictable environment. Douglas Hofstadter himself, known for his work on self-reference, recursion, and the nature of consciousness, likely appreciated the law not just as a practical observation, but as a philosophical insight. Life, like the law, is recursive. We make plans. Those plans shift, and we adjust to those shifts with new plans, which also shift. Hofstadter's law is humorous, yes, but it also captures something fundamentally human, our effort to predict and control a world that often resists prediction and control. In closing, Hofstadter's law remains one of the most relatable and enduring aphorisms of modern cognitive science and project planning. Its recursive structure reflects the recursive nature of thought and work. Its warning is gentle but unyielding. Even when you think you've accounted for everything, something unanticipated will stretch your timeline. The better we understand this truth, the more effectively we can navigate the unavoidable delays of complex life. Hofstadter's law doesn't say you shouldn't plan, only that you should plan for your plan to take longer than you think, even when you think it won't. Parkinson's law is a concise yet remarkably accurate observation of human behavior. Work expands to fill the time allotted to it, This principle was first articulated by Cyril Northcote Parkinson, a British naval historian and writer, in a satirical essay published in The Economist in 1955. The idea resonated so strongly that it soon became the foundation of Parkinson's broader theories on bureaucratic inefficiency, and it was later expanded upon in his 1958 book Parkinson's Law, The Pursuit of Progress. While initially offered with wit and irony, Parkinson's Law has since been recognized as a valuable insight into time management, organizational behavior, and human psychology. Parkinson drew his observations from his experiences working within the British civil service, where he noticed a peculiar phenomenon. As bureaucracies grew larger, they seemed to become less efficient, not more. Jobs that could have been completed quickly and simply would often drag out unnecessarily. This wasn't necessarily due to laziness or incompetence, but rather because the structure and culture of the organization allowed tasks to stretch in duration until they consumed all the time available. Parkinson humorously described how a simple task, such as sending a postcard, could be delayed for an entire day due to a series of exaggerated and unnecessary intermediate steps. His conclusion was not that work becomes more complex, but that people tend to make it more complex to fit the amount of time they have been given. At its core, Parkinson's Law is a commentary on the elasticity of tasks. When given a deadline, people unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, adjust their pace, focus, and detail level to ensure that the work consumes all of the time provided. This may involve unnecessary refinements, procrastination, overplanning, or the invention of additional subtasks. In academic terms, this behavior ties into the field of behavioral economics and the psychology of motivation. Humans are not purely rational actors. We often use time inefficiently when left without clear constraints or incentives. When there's too much time, urgency disappears, and without urgency, focus tends to degrade. The psychological underpinnings of Parkinson's Law involve a few key cognitive biases. One is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take. The flip side, however, is that once time is fixed, say, a 2-week deadline for a report, our minds reframe the task as something that must take 2 weeks, even if the core work could be completed in 3 days. People often associate time with importance. If a project is given a long timeline, it must be significant and require extensive effort. This leads to scope creep, where a simple task becomes more complex through added details and peripheral activities, not because the work demands it, but because time allows it. Parkinson's Law is also closely related to a behavioral concept called time inconsistency, which explains why people often fail to stick to plans over time. If someone is given 3 days to complete a task that actually takes 1, they may delay starting until the last moment, essentially compressing the task into the final hours. The phenomenon of cramming before deadlines, so common among students and professionals alike, is a classic example. The work doesn't necessarily take more effort. It just gets deferred and then rushed when urgency finally arrives. This behavior is not just an individual problem, but is often institutionalized in organizations. Large corporations and government agencies frequently suffer from bloated timelines and redundant processes, not because their missions require them, but because structures have evolved that reward time-consuming work. In a bureaucratic setting, completing a task too quickly may even be discouraged, as it can imply that the work was too simple or that resources were misallocated. Workers might fear that if they consistently finish ahead of schedule, their workload will simply increase or their job may be deemed unnecessary. As a result, they may unconsciously stretch tasks to match the expected duration. Real-world examples of Parkinson's law are everywhere. In software development, if a team is given 6 months to release a new feature, the feature often takes 6 months to deliver even if the bulk of it was finished in the first 2. The remaining time might be spent polishing, testing, rethinking, or justifying the timeline. While quality control is essential, there is often a point of diminishing returns. The longer the timeline, the more likely it is that effort will be expended on minor issues that contribute little to the end-user experience. In education, assignments given with long deadlines tend to provoke procrastination. A term paper due in 10 weeks is often written in the last 2. The time was there, but the work expanded only when the deadline began to loom. Similarly, meetings that are scheduled for an hour will often take the full hour, even if the agenda could be covered in 20 minutes. Discussions meander, topics digress, and people fill the time simply because it's available. This is not necessarily malicious. It's a natural consequence of human behavior when time is treated as a flexible resource rather than a constraint. Parkinson's law also applies to personal productivity. Individuals who work from home often find that their tasks swell to match the length of the workday. A 2-hour task may take all morning if the day has no structure. Conversely, when people impose shorter, focused work sessions on themselves, such as the Pomodoro technique, where one works in 25-minute intervals, they often find that they accomplish far more in less time. This supports the idea that constraint breeds efficiency. When time is scarce, priorities sharpen and distractions are minimized. Interestingly, modern productivity tools can both exacerbate and alleviate Parkinson's law. On the one hand, project management software that allows for endless scheduling, task splitting, and dependency tracking can invite over-planning and unnecessary elaboration. On the other hand, tools that promote short sprints, time tracking, and hard limits can enforce discipline and combat task sprawl. The difference lies in how the tools are used, whether they serve to constrain effort or to spread it out. One fascinating implication of Parkinson's law is its application to email and digital communication. The more time people spend reading and replying to emails, the more emails they seem to receive and generate. Time spent on email expands to fill the hours allocated to it. People begin to treat email as part of the job, rather than as a tool to support the job. This creates feedback loops of low-efficiency activity that consume large portions of the day. In urban planning and economics, a parallel idea exists in the concept of induced demand. For example, when cities expand roadways to reduce traffic congestion, more people choose to drive, and the congestion often returns to previous levels or worse. Space expands, and so does the use of that space. Similarly, Parkinson's law predicts that as capacity grows, whether time, resources, or infrastructure, so too does usage, often negating the intended benefit. Over the years, various countermeasures have been developed to deal with Parkinson's law. One effective strategy is time boxing, which involves allocating fixed time blocks for tasks and sticking to them regardless of the outcome. This enforces a sense of urgency and helps individuals focus on essential deliverables. Another approach is setting earlier internal deadlines ahead of formal ones, a method often used in journalism and publishing, where production schedules must be met. In corporate environments, agile development cycles and lean management philosophies also attempt to combat Parkinson's law by emphasizing short, iterative bursts of focused work. Cyril Northcote Parkinson's original essay may have been tongue-in-cheek, but its message has proven enduring and universal. The law is a testament to the psychological complexity of time perception and task management. It explains not only inefficiency and bureaucracies, but also the personal struggles individuals face in trying to manage their time effectively. While the temptation to fill available time with work will always be present, awareness of this tendency allows people and organizations to build systems that promote efficiency over expansion. Ultimately, Parkinson's law teaches us that constraints can be powerful allies in the pursuit of productivity. When we limit time, we force ourselves to make choices, to focus on what truly matters, and to let go of perfectionism or unnecessary complexity. By understanding that work tends to expand to fill the time given, we can learn to give ourselves less time, just enough to get the job done well, but not so much that it drifts, swells, and consumes more than it should. Feinagle's law is one of those aphorisms that lives at the intersection of science, skepticism, and humor, revealing a persistent and humbling truth about the nature of human error and complexity. The law states, if an experiment appears to succeed, something has been overlooked. It is often considered a close cousin or variant of Murphy's Law, but it carries a subtle difference in tone and emphasis. Where Murphy's Law suggests that things will inevitably go wrong, Feinagle's Law points to a more specific source of trouble, the human tendency to miss something critical when things seem to be going well. It warns scientists, engineers, and anyone working with complex systems that success may be an illusion masking a flaw, and that the most dangerous moment may be when everything seems to be working perfectly. The origins of Feinagle's Law are somewhat murky, wrapped in a cloud of engineering folklore, hacker culture, and tongue-in-cheek fatalism. The phrase is often credited to John W. Campbell Jr., a legendary science fiction editor and writer who helped define the genre during the mid-20th century. Campbell was known for his interest in pseudoscience, metaphysics, and scientific speculation, and he frequently encouraged playful thinking around scientific failure. However, the phrase became more widely popularized through the science fiction writer Larry Niven, who humorously attributed it to a fictional deity known as Feinagle and his mad prophet Murphy in his works. While no single person can be definitively named as the inventor of Feinagle's Law, its spread in the 1960s and 70s coincided with the rise of systems engineering, space exploration, and computer science fields where the danger of hidden errors is not just theoretical, but real and often catastrophic. Scientifically, Feinagle's Law speaks to the limits of human perception and the inherent uncertainty in complex systems. In any experiment, be it a scientific study, a piece of software, or a machine test, the appearance of success can be deceptive. Data may look clean, results may seem conclusive, or a device might function flawlessly, but this surface-level success can obscure underlying flaws, a miscalibrated sensor, a hidden assumption, an unaccounted variable. This tendency is amplified by cognitive biases, especially confirmation bias, where people favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs or expectations. When a scientist expects a result and gets it, the temptation is to accept the result at face value rather than interrogate it for errors. Feinagle's Law reminds us that this is often the moment when we should be most skeptical. Another psychological factor behind the law is the illusion of control. People often believe they understand a system better than they actually do, especially if early results are favorable. This can lead to overconfidence and premature conclusions. For example, a drug trial might show promising outcomes in a small test group, leading researchers to assume efficacy, only for larger trials to reveal previously unseen side effects or ineffectiveness. The initial success wasn't false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Something had been overlooked, perhaps a demographic factor, a flawed sampling method, or a statistical artifact. Feinigel's law also aligns with broader principles in scientific philosophy, particularly those espoused by Karl Popper, who emphasize the importance of falsifiability and critical scrutiny in science. A result should be trusted not because it appears successful, but because it has withstood repeated attempts to disprove it. In this light, Feinigel's law becomes a caution against complacency. Success must be tested, challenged, and interrogated, not simply accepted. This principle is central to scientific rigor. An unexplained success is not a triumph, it's a red flag. In real-world scientific practice, Feinigel's law plays out in countless examples. One of the most famous cases occurred during the early years of spaceflight. The Mars Climate Orbiter, launched by NASA in 1998, appeared to be functioning correctly throughout much of its journey. But when it reached Mars, it burned up in the atmosphere instead of entering orbit. An investigation revealed that a failure to convert units from imperial to metric had gone unnoticed. The navigation data had appeared correct because the error didn't create visible problems during the earlier phases of the mission. This is Feinigel's law in action. The appearance of success masked a fatal oversight. In particle physics, the OPERA experiment in 2011 famously appeared to measure neutrinos traveling faster than light, a result that, if true, would have upended Einstein's theory of relativity. Scientists were understandably skeptical and began searching for errors. Eventually, they discovered a loose fiber optic cable connection and a miscalibrated clock in their equipment. What had looked like a groundbreaking success turned out to be a technical glitch. Once again, Feinigel's law had been proved correct. The appearance of extraordinary success demanded extraordinary scrutiny, and the flaw, though subtle, had been missed. Feinigel's law is also a common companion in fields like engineering and software development. A piece of code that seems to run perfectly on the first try often inspires suspicion among experienced developers. More often than not, they'll double-check to see if they actually ran the right test or if the inputs were valid. There's a deep awareness that a program appearing to work can mask bugs, logical flaws, or untested edge cases. It is common practice in software engineering to include rigorous unit tests, integration tests, and peer reviews precisely because success on its own is not sufficient evidence of correctness. In medicine, the stakes of overlooked errors are even higher. A surgical technique might appear to succeed in the short term, but long-term data could reveal complications that weren't initially visible. A diagnostic test might return consistent results, but without a deep understanding of what the test is truly measuring, those results could lead to incorrect treatment. Feinigel's law reminds clinicians and researchers that trust in outcomes must be earned through continual scrutiny and questioning. Interestingly, Feinigel's law also plays a subtle role in education. Students may believe they've understood a concept because they can solve a few problems correctly, but this may mask a shallow understanding. A correct answer might be the result of memorization, luck, or pattern recognition rather than true comprehension. This is why educators increasingly emphasize the process of learning over the outcome. If a student appears to succeed too easily, it may be that the challenge was insufficient or that some deeper misunderstanding was left unchecked. Beyond the scientific and technical realms, Feinigel's law has philosophical implications as well. It cautions us against mistaking appearances for reality, reminding us that truth often hides beneath the surface. In relationships, business, and politics, early success can be seductive, leading individuals and organizations to ignore warning signs or suppress doubt. A startup that grows rapidly may seem successful until it collapses under the weight of a fragile business model. A political movement that gains quick popularity might seem legitimate until its foundations are tested by deeper scrutiny. In each case, the appearance of success is not evidence of real stability. Something crucial may have been missed. One of the most fascinating aspects of Finagle's law is how it fosters a mindset of humility. It encourages scientists, engineers, and thinkers to adopt a healthy skepticism not only toward failure, but also toward success. It teaches that doubt and inquiry should not be suspended simply because things appear to be going well. This mindset is foundational to good science and rational thinking. It promotes a culture in which success is interrogated with the same rigor as failure, and where appearances are never taken at face value. Ultimately, Finagle's law is not a call to pessimism, but to vigilance. It doesn't say that success is impossible, only that it must be earned through careful, continuous questioning. It reminds us that the universe is complex, systems are fragile, and human perception is fallible. When things go right, it may be because we got lucky or because we haven't yet discovered what's gone wrong. That's why Finagle's law remains so resonant in every field where understanding complexity matters. Success is not the end of investigation, but the beginning. Rutherford's law, typically phrased as, "If your experiment needs statistics, you did something wrong," is a provocative and famously blunt statement attributed to Ernest Rutherford, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century. Known as the father of nuclear physics, Rutherford made groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of atomic structure, particularly through his gold foil experiment, which led to the discovery of the atomic nucleus. The quote reflects his empirical, hands-on approach to experimentation and his belief in clear, unmistakable results in physical sciences. Although the quote is often taken at face value as a criticism of statistical methods, it is more accurately understood in the context of Rutherford's time, his scientific philosophy, and the nature of the experiments he conducted. Ernest Rutherford was born in New Zealand in 1871 and moved to the United Kingdom to study at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. He was a pioneer in radioactivity and nuclear physics and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1908 for his work on the disintegration of elements. Rutherford's experimental style was direct and elegant, focused on obtaining definitive empirical evidence that could not be mistaken or misinterpreted. He famously split the atom, demonstrated the existence of the proton, and laid the foundations for the modern understanding of atomic physics. For Rutherford, a good experiment produced results that were visible, repeatable, and irrefutable. He believed that if an effect were real and significant, it should be directly observable without the need for complex statistical interpretation. When Rutherford is quoted as saying that if an experiment requires statistics, something has gone wrong, he was not dismissing all of statistics as a field, but rather expressing skepticism toward results that are only statistically significant in a marginal or ambiguous way. In his view, physical laws should manifest in clear, unmistakable ways. For example, if a scientist is testing whether particles scatter in a certain pattern and can see the scattering directly on a screen, there's little need for further statistical analysis. The result is evident to the eye. Rutherford believed that nature, when asked the right question with the right tools, would answer unambiguously. This perspective was influenced by the types of experiments Rutherford was conducting, which were generally low noise and high signal. In his most famous experiment, alpha particles were fired at a thin sheet of gold foil. The expectation, based on the prevailing plum pudding model of the atom, was that the particles would pass through largely undisturbed. Instead, some particles bounced back at sharp angles, a startling result that suggested the presence of a small, dense nucleus within the atom. This result didn't require advanced statistics to interpret. The deviation was stark and undeniable. It was a smoking gun kind of result, the kind Rutherford favored. However, as science advanced into fields with more complexity, subtlety, and noise, such as quantum mechanics, biochemistry, and epidemiology, the role of statistical analysis became increasingly important. In these fields, effects are often small and embedded within a background of natural variation or experimental noise. In such cases, statistics help scientists determine whether observed differences are real or simply due to chance. While Rutherford's comment was rooted in the experimental clarity of early 20th century physics, modern science often operates in messier domains where such clarity is not always possible. The scientific explanation behind the increasing need for statistics in experiments lies in the nature of measurement and variability. All measurement systems have some degree of error, whether due to instrument precision, observer variation, or environmental factors. When trying to detect subtle effects such as a slight change in enzyme activity or a weak gravitational wave, these small signals can easily be obscured by noise. Statistical methods allow scientists to extract meaningful patterns from large datasets, identify correlations, and assess the probability that a given result is due to random variation rather than a true effect. Despite this, Rutherford's law continues to resonate in scientific culture because it serves as a cautionary reminder against over-reliance on statistical significance. A result that is statistically significant, for example, with a p-value of less than 0.05, may not be practically significant or even real if the underlying effect is too small, poorly understood, or the experiment is poorly controlled. In many scientific fields, there has been growing concern about the replication crisis, where studies, especially in psychology and biomedicine, cannot be reliably replicated. Often, these studies relied heavily on statistical methods to detect marginal effects in small sample sizes. Rutherford's dictum thus reminds researchers to strive for robustness and clarity, not just statistical plausibility. Real-life examples of the implications of Rutherford's law are abundant, especially in areas where statistical methods are misused or overinterpreted. In clinical trials, for instance, a drug might be approved based on a statistically significant improvement in patient outcomes, but if the improvement is minuscule and not clinically meaningful, the approval could lead to public misunderstanding and wasted resources. The antidepressant reboxetine, for example, was found in initial studies to have a statistically significant effect compared to placebo, but later reviews showed that it was no more effective than placebo in practice and had more side effects than alternatives. The early results had statistical support but lacked the kind of robust, observable benefit that would satisfy a physicist like Rutherford. In physics, however, there have been notable moments where the absence of statistical clarity delayed important discoveries. The discovery of the Higgs boson at CERN in 2012 required a massive dataset and complex statistical analysis to confirm that the observed particle was not a fluke. Physicists used a 5 sigma threshold, a 1 in 3.5 million chance of error, to declare discovery. This is an example where statistical methods were not a crutch, but an essential part of validating an extremely subtle and rare signal. While Rutherford might have raised an eyebrow at such a process, Even he would likely appreciate the rigor required to prove something in a deeply complex domain like particle physics. The philosophical underpinning of Rutherford's law also extends into questions about epistemology, how we know what we know. Rutherford favored a direct correspondence between experimental result and natural law. If a theory is correct, it should be confirmed by a result that is obvious and compelling. This view, while elegant, doesn't always hold up in modern science, where systems are often nonlinear, interdependent, and dynamic. The brain, for example, is an immensely complicated organ, and no single experiment is likely to reveal its workings without the use of statistics to discern patterns across populations and contexts. Still, Rutherford's skepticism toward marginal results has been vindicated in many scientific debates. In nutrition science, for example, conflicting studies about the effects of certain foods or supplements often arise from statistical noise, confounding variables, and poor experimental controls. One year, coffee is good for you. The next year, it isn't. The public becomes confused because many of these studies report statistical associations without strong, mechanistic explanations or reproducible effects. Rutherford would likely argue that if coffee truly had a dramatic effect on health, we wouldn't need to sift through hundreds of marginal studies to find it. It would be obvious. In summary, Rutherford's law is not a rejection of statistics as a tool, but a challenge to scientists to aim for results that are robust, clear, and reproducible. It calls for humility in the face of complexity and encourages a scientific culture that values direct evidence and deep understanding over statistical tricks and marginal findings. Ernest Rutherford's own experiments exemplified this ethos: careful design, precise execution, and unmistakable outcomes. While modern science has expanded into realms where statistics are not just useful but essential, the spirit of Rutherford's law remains vital. It reminds us that the best science is not only statistically sound, but also conceptually clear and empirically strong. When something is truly real in the natural world, it should, ideally, be visible not just in p-values, but in the undeniable weight of the evidence itself. Jennings's law, often phrased as, "the deeper you dig into a topic, the higher the chance that someone already did it and got a Nobel Prize for it," is a humorous yet strikingly accurate reflection of a common experience in the world of scientific research, academic exploration, and intellectual discovery. It captures the frustration and humility many scholars encounter when they invest weeks or even months chasing an idea, believing they may be on the edge of something new, only to discover that the breakthrough they hoped for was already made sometimes decades earlier by someone who was not only faster, but also happened to win the highest honors for it. This law doesn't just speak to the difficulty of being original in the modern world of knowledge. It also highlights the sheer depth and breadth of prior human thought, the speed of scientific progress, and the vast scale of academic memory. While the phrase Jennings' law is less formally established than some of the other aphoristic laws, like Murphy's or Parkinson's, it is circulated in academic circles, especially among early career researchers and graduate students, as an ironic reflection on the reality of academic discovery. The origins of the phrase are not clearly documented, and unlike more widely recognized eponyms such as Hofstadter's law or Rutherford's law, there is no definitive record of a specific person named Jennings who first coined it. Instead, the name serves more as a placeholder for the collective academic experience, and may even have evolved organically through conversations, jokes, and shared frustrations in university labs and libraries. At its heart, Jennings's law is a commentary on the increasing specialization of knowledge and the challenges of novelty in research. In the early days of modern science, it was still possible for a single individual to make contributions across multiple fields. Leonardo da Vinci could explore anatomy, engineering, and art. Isaac Newton could revolutionize physics and invent calculus. But as centuries passed, science and academia evolved into highly specialized domains. Today, researchers often spend their entire careers working on a narrow slice of a subfield, and even then, they find themselves building upon the work of countless predecessors. The accumulation of knowledge has grown so dense that what seems novel to a fresh researcher is often already well-trodden ground for someone else, sometimes even published in a little-known journal decades earlier. This reality is particularly acute for graduate students and young scientists who, full of enthusiasm, dive into a topic with a bold hypothesis or an exciting idea, only to be met with the deflating discovery that their idea has already been explored, modeled, or even awarded. It is not uncommon for a student to walk into their advisor's office, excited to pitch a new project, only to be told, "That's a great idea. Someone did it in 1973. It won a Nobel in 1986. The experience is not just humbling, it's a rite of passage. It teaches the importance of literature reviews, the value of historical context, and the sobering recognition that originality today often means finding a novel perspective or application, rather than discovering something entirely unprecedented. Scientifically, Jennings's law illustrates how knowledge operates within cumulative paradigms. Thomas Kuhn, in his influential book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, describes science as progressing through periods of normal science, punctuated by paradigm shifts. During normal science, researchers work within established frameworks, filling in gaps, confirming theories, or exploring implications. Paradigm shifts occur when existing frameworks are upended by groundbreaking discoveries. What Jennings' law points to is the reality that most researchers, consciously or not, are working within existing paradigms. And within those paradigms, many of the low-hanging fruit have already been picked. To truly innovate, one must reach higher, dig deeper, or think sideways, and even then, the odds are that someone may have already beaten you to it. Interestingly, the law is not just a source of frustration. It's also a testament to the effectiveness of scientific enterprise. The fact that someone already had your idea and developed it to the point of global recognition suggests that science works, that good ideas are discoverable, that there is a kind of inevitability to certain discoveries when the time is right. This notion of multiple discovery has been studied in the history of science. Scholars have documented numerous cases where major inventions or scientific insights occurred independently and nearly simultaneously in different parts of the world. The calculus, for instance, was developed independently by Newton and Leibniz. The theory of evolution by natural selection was conceived both by Darwin and Wallace. The telephone, the jet engine, and even the theory of relativity had precursors or parallel thinkers. Jennings' law might just reflect the tail end of this principle. By the time you think of something, it may have already occurred to someone else, and the window of novelty may already be closed. There are real-life examples across scientific disciplines that illustrate the sting of Jennings' law. In biology, the discovery of DNA structure by Watson and Crick was a Nobel-worthy breakthrough, but it built upon crucial insights and data from Rosalind Franklin, whose work was essential but under-recognized for many years. Later, researchers diving into the structure of genetic materials may have thought they were on the verge of something new, only to discover they were unknowingly replicating Franklin's foundational work. In physics, numerous attempts to explain subatomic particles and quantum behaviors have often circled back to ideas that were already proposed in early 20th century literature, obscure, sometimes forgotten, but not new. In computer science, where progress is often rapid and publication turnover is dizzying, researchers frequently find themselves scooped. A graduate student may devise a new algorithm only to find that it was implemented 5 years earlier in a little-known conference paper. Patent offices regularly receive applications for inventions that already exist in slightly different forms, and reviewers often reject them with the remark that prior art exists. In the tech world, entire startups have been formed around ideas that were already explored, shelved, or acquired by others years ago. Jennings' law also applies in humanities and philosophy. A thinker might develop a theory of perception or ethics, feeling confident in its novelty, only to encounter a similar theory in the works of a philosopher from the 19th century, or perhaps from an ancient tradition. The sheer volume of existing literature means that most truly original thoughts have precedence, even if they are re-expressed through modern lenses. This does not make the new version irrelevant. It can still add value, clarity, or contemporary relevance, but the thrill of being first often fades under the shadow of history. Interestingly, Jennings' law has also found resonance in internet culture and creative industries. Writers, artists, and musicians often experience it when they develop a plot, melody, or concept, only to discover that someone else already did it, and often more successfully. In memes, this feeling is sometimes summarized with the phrase, "Simpsons did it," referring to the animated show's uncanny ability to preemptively parody or predict cultural events, themes, or tropes. A creator may feel they have come up with an original idea only to realize that pop culture or academia beat them to it years earlier. Despite its slightly cynical tone, Jennings's law offers valuable lessons. It emphasizes the importance of thorough research and humility. It encourages would-be innovators to do their homework not just to avoid redundancy, but to learn from the insights of those who came before. It teaches that creativity is not just about novelty, but about refinement, synthesis, and communication. Even if your idea is not new, the way you express it, apply it, or teach it can still be valuable. Originality in the modern world often lies not in discovering new continents, but in drawing better maps of the ones we already know exist. Perhaps most importantly, Jennings' law is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is a communal, intergenerational effort. Even if someone else had your idea first, your work can still matter. You are part of a lineage, adding bricks to a structure that no one can complete alone. The recognition that others have walked your path before you doesn't invalidate your journey, it contextualizes it. And sometimes, in the process of discovering that someone else won a Nobel Prize for your idea, you find the inspiration and direction to pursue the next one armed with more humility, greater awareness, and the resilience to dig deeper still. Etter's observation, most commonly phrased as "the other line always moves faster," is one of those deceptively simple expressions that captures a universal human experience and subtly explores deep psychological, sociological, and statistical truths. While not originally born out of formal science, this observation resonates with nearly everyone who has stood in a supermarket checkout line, waited in traffic, applied for grants or jobs, or simply tried to navigate any system where queues, delays, and randomness come into play. A more modern academic variation of this saying, often delivered with a wry smile, is, "The grant goes to the person who applied 1 minute after you." In both versions, the core idea is the same. Our subjective experience often makes us feel that we are the unlucky ones, that others have better timing, that somehow the universe favors the next person over us, and that systems of reward and access seem to operate just out of sync with our efforts. While this might sound like a case of pessimistic bias or simple bad luck, there are actually compelling psychological and mathematical explanations that reveal why Ettores' observation feels so universally true. The origin of the phrase is attributed to a man named Ettore Boiardi, an Italian-American chef who became known more popularly under the brand name Chef Boyardee. While he himself may not have formulated the observation in the precise form we know it today, the attribution has endured more as a cultural anecdote than a rigorously documented historical fact. Like many of the so-called laws of human behavior, Murphy's Law, Parkinson's Law, or Hofstadter's Law, Ettores' observation grew out of collective experience rather than any particular scientific formulation. It was adopted and repeated not because it was derived from first principles, but because it described a phenomenon so many people instinctively recognized in their daily lives. Scientifically speaking, Ettores' observation aligns closely with several known cognitive biases, most notably the availability heuristic and confirmation bias. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where people estimate the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. Since the feeling of being in the slower line is frustrating and emotionally salient, we tend to remember those experiences more vividly than the times we were in the faster line. When we do end up in the faster line, we often don't notice it or don't remember it, because there's no pain point that embeds the moment in memory. Confirmation bias compounds this effect. We notice and remember instances that confirm our belief that we are always in the slower line, and we unconsciously ignore those that contradict it. Over time, we build a narrative where Ettores' observation seems not just frequent but inevitable. But there's also a powerful statistical and probabilistic foundation that supports Ettores' observation. This lies in what mathematicians and physicists call queuing theory, the study of lines, wait times, and service systems. One of the most interesting features of multiple queue systems is that when you have several lines moving at different rates, such as supermarket checkouts or toll booths, the probability of being in the fastest line is actually quite low. If you randomly choose among, say, 5 lines, your chance of picking the fastest one is only 1 in 5, or 20%. In other words, you're far more likely to be in a slower line than in the fastest one simply due to probability. Add to that the natural human tendency to switch lines based on perceived speed, and you have a recipe for dissatisfaction. People who switch lines tend to feel worse if the line they left speeds up, reinforcing the belief that they always choose wrong. In grant application processes or competitive admissions, this effect is even more psychologically charged. The idea that the grant goes to the person who applied 1 minute after you combines two deeply frustrating feelings: near miss and randomness. When people apply for competitive opportunities, they invest time, effort, and emotion. Learning that someone else received the award with only a slightly later application or a marginally different approach triggers what psychologists call counterfactual thinking, the mental process of imagining what might have been. These counterfactuals are emotionally intense and often more powerful when the difference is small. Missing a bus by 10 seconds feels worse than missing it by 10 minutes because it was so close. Similarly, losing a grant by 1 point or being passed over in favor of a nearly identical proposal feels more unjust than losing by a large margin. Ettore's observation taps into this realm of human perception, where the proximity of success amplifies the sting of failure. Another aspect that gives Ettore's observation its staying power is the growing complexity and opacity of modern bureaucratic systems. Whether it's applying for visas, scholarships, job positions, or healthcare services, people often feel that outcomes are determined not just by merit but by timing, luck, or unseen variables. The belief that the system is capricious or favoring others is deeply reinforced when you have no transparency into how decisions are made. You may never know why your application was rejected or delayed, only that someone else's went through more smoothly. This leads to a sense of randomness that feels indistinguishable from the frustration described in Ettore's observation. People feel like victims of systemic inefficiency, bad timing, or cosmic indifference. Interestingly, Ettore's observation has found strong expression in pop culture and media. In traffic scenes from films or satire about bureaucracy, it's common to depict a character switching lanes only to have their original lane speed up the moment they leave it. Sitcoms and comic strips have long capitalized on the humor of someone always ending up in the worst possible line. The popularity of such depictions speaks to the deeply shared emotional experience behind them. In fact, entire advertising campaigns have been built on these ideas, selling everything from faster internet to express checkout lanes, because they tap into that nagging frustration we all know so well. But the observation also holds an odd kind of wisdom. It suggests a mindfulness about human impatience and the illusion of control. By recognizing that our perceptions are skewed and that randomness often governs outcomes, we might become more accepting of small delays and less quick to assume that the universe is singling us out for inconvenience. Philosophically, Ettore's observation is a humorous nudge toward humility. It tells us that we are not as uniquely unlucky as we think. We're just human, caught in systems too large and complex for our minds to fully grasp. It also reminds us to temper our expectations and practice patience, since randomness and probability are, in many ways, the great equalizers of experience. Real-life examples of Ettore's observation are everywhere. In academic conference registration lines, the person who picks the shortest line often ends up waiting the longest because of a malfunctioning credit card reader or a slow conversation at the front. In job markets, candidates with nearly identical resumes may see vastly different outcomes due to tiny random differences in the timing or sequence of their applications. In public transport, two buses may be scheduled evenly apart, but due to traffic, one gets overcrowded while the other remains empty, and you always seem to be on the former. These examples are not just coincidences. They're built into the nature of systems that deal with flow, competition, and constrained resources. In sum, Ettore's observation endures not just because it's funny or pessimistic, but because it captures a fundamental truth about how we interact with the world. It elegantly blends psychology, probability, and lived experience into a single phrase that feels both personal and universal. Whether standing in line at the bank or submitting an important application, we are always at the mercy of systems we don't fully control, and we process those experiences through minds that are wired to notice injustice, remember frustration, and amplify regret. Rather than fight it, we can learn from Ettore's wisdom to approach these moments with humor, perspective, and maybe just a bit more patience. After all, the other line might not really be moving faster. It only feels that way because we're the ones standing still. Grebner's law, succinctly phrased as, "Any error in a drawing will be discovered only after the material has been cut," is a timeless aphorism in engineering, architecture, construction, and any craft involving design followed by irreversible action. It speaks not only to the perennial frustration of human error, but also to the sometimes cruel relationship between theoretical plans and practical execution. More than a commentary on flawed drawings, Grebner's law embodies the unpredictable gap between planning and doing, between design intent and physical reality. Like Murphy's Law and other observational laws born from professional experience rather than formal science, Grebner's Law expresses a deeply relatable truth through a blend of dry humor and weary realism. Though its origin is less documented and the identity of Grebner remains somewhat obscure, the law's resonance among engineers, drafters, machinists, carpenters, and builders worldwide has given it enduring life. In its most literal interpretation, Grebner's law concerns blueprints or technical drawings, documents that guide the fabrication or assembly of components in fields like architecture, mechanical engineering, and construction. These drawings are assumed to be precise and final, often representing the culmination of many hours of measurement, design, and review. Yet in practice, small oversights, typographical errors, incorrect dimensions, or conceptual misinterpretations often remain hidden until it's too late. The key tragedy of Grebner's law is not simply that errors exist. Everyone accepts that mistakes happen, but that these errors tend to surface only at the most inconvenient moment, after irreversible action has taken place. Once a metal sheet has been cut, or a foundation poured, or a beam welded into place, the mistake reveals itself, mocking the planner's confidence and forcing a costly correction, if correction is even possible. While the exact origin of the phrase Grebner's law is difficult to pin down, its sentiment has been echoed in engineering culture for over a century. It's likely that the phrase emerged informally in drafting offices or machine shops, where seasoned professionals passed on bits of hard-earned wisdom to their apprentices. In environments where physical materials are expensive and processes are labor-intensive, the consequences of mistakes can be significant. Unlike digital errors that can be undone with a keystroke, a miscut piece of steel or a misdrilled hole can render entire projects compromised. This makes the timing of error detection crucial. That the mistake is discovered only after the action cannot be reversed adds a layer of fatalism and comedy that professionals find all too familiar. Psychologically, Grebner's law highlights the limitations of human perception and attention under conditions of complexity. Blueprints and technical schematics are dense, detailed documents. Even with multiple revisions and cross-checks, small errors can evade detection. This is due in part to a cognitive bias known as change blindness, in which the brain fails to notice small anomalies when it is overloaded with information. Another relevant bias is confirmation bias, where designers and reviewers unconsciously see what they expect to see. If a designer believes the plan is correct, they may gloss over inconsistencies or mislabeling in a table of dimensions. These errors then sit quietly until they intersect with reality, usually in a fabrication shop or on a job site where physics, not assumptions, takes control. Statistically, Grebner's law is tied to the probability of detection as a function of time and irreversibility. In many workflows, review processes focus on early-stage errors, those visible during drawing or digital modeling. However, more subtle errors often remain latent until a downstream process activates them. For example, a reversed orientation in a mirrored component might not cause problems until pieces are laid out on the shop floor. The point at which the material is cut or assembled serves as a kind of commit point, after which errors can no longer be handled abstractly. They become physical, visible, and expensive. This last-minute detection is not purely anecdotal, but has parallels in systems engineering and software development, where bugs tend to surface during deployment rather than in sandbox testing environments. The law also has a practical corollary. The cost of correcting a mistake increases dramatically the later it is discovered. This is known in project management as the cost of change curve. A minor design flaw identified during the conceptual stage might require only minutes to correct. The same flaw, if discovered after physical implementation, might require rework, procurement of new materials, schedule delays, and budget overruns. The punchline of Grebner's law that you only find out after the cut reflects this brutal cost disparity and adds a sense of fatal inevitability. Across industries, real-world examples of Grebner's law abound. In architecture, structural columns have been poured in the wrong location because of a misreading of blueprint dimensions. In aerospace, multi-million-dollar components have been scrapped because two teams interpreted a drawings unit system differently, imperial versus metric. In one famous case, the Mars Climate Orbiter mission failed because of a mismatch between metric and imperial measurements between collaborating teams. While that specific instance may not have involved a literal blueprint, it's a conceptual cousin of Grebner's law. A design assumption went unchecked until the point of no return, resulting in irreversible failure. In manufacturing, there are countless examples of precision parts cut to incorrect tolerances because of transposed digits or outdated revision documents. In some cases, entire production runs must be halted or discarded. In woodworking, even a small miscalculation in a joint design can mean the difference between a flush corner and an unfixable gap. Carpenters and machinists often develop instinctive habits of double-checking measurements, precisely because they know from experience how rare it is for drawings to survive contact with physical materials unscathed. Interestingly, Grebner's law has also entered the software development world, albeit metaphorically. In software design, the drawing is the architecture document or specification. The cutting of material is the moment of code deployment or release. Developers often joke that the true bugs, the ones that matter, only appear after the software is shipped to production, even after rigorous testing. Once users interact with the system in real-world conditions, previously hidden flaws come to light. The analogy is clear. The theoretical plan appears solid until it collides with reality, at which point latent errors become painfully visible. To mitigate the impact of Grebner's law, professionals often develop rituals and systems for quality assurance. Measure twice, cut once is an old tradesman's mantra that directly addresses the risk of irreversibility. Peer reviews, mock-ups, simulations, and prototyping are all tools used to surface potential issues before final execution. In modern engineering, 3D modeling and digital twins allow for virtual walkthroughs of projects, helping to identify design flaws early. Still, despite all these precautions, errors continue to slip through, reinforcing the persistent truth of Grebner's law. What gives the law its enduring appeal is not just its practical relevance, but its existential tone. It captures the gap between human intention and real-world consequence, the way even our most careful plans can unravel when put into action. There's a humility embedded in the law, a recognition that no amount of foresight can guarantee perfection, and that the universe often saves its cruelest jokes for the moment when we are least prepared to undo them. It also serves as a quiet tribute to the craftsmanship of those who work close to materials and tools, who bear the burden of design errors even when they did not make them, and who are often expected to fix problems that originated upstream in the process. In the end, Grebner's law is less a warning than a reality check. It reminds us that errors are not just possible, they are inevitable, and they often wait patiently until their discovery will cause the most disruption. For anyone who works with plans, builds things, or translates ideas into physical form, the law is a badge of shared experience, a nod to the universality of imperfection, and a call for humility in the face of systems too complex for any one mind to fully contain. The documentation law, which states that the complexity of a project is inversely proportional to the amount of documentation written, is one of those humorous but hauntingly accurate observations that stem not from formal research, but from repeated lived experience across engineering, software development, academia, and project management. While no single figure can be definitively credited with its invention, this law has been passed around office corridors, development teams, and research departments for decades, often spoken half in jest and half in frustration. It reflects a recurring phenomenon. The more complicated and tangled a system or project becomes, the less likely it is to be thoroughly documented. Conversely, projects that are simple, straightforward, or even trivial often come with exhaustive documentation, notes, diagrams, and revision histories. This paradox, which seems almost counterintuitive at first, can be explained through a blend of psychology, workflow dynamics, and organizational behavior. Though often associated with software engineering, the principle behind the documentation law is widely applicable. In software, it's not uncommon to find legacy systems critical, highly complex pieces of code that underpin essential infrastructure existing without any meaningful documentation. Developers inheriting such systems are often left to decipher thousands of lines of code like archaeologists, with nothing more than variable names and function calls as clues. Ironically, a simple utility script written by a junior engineer might come with full markdown files, usage instructions, diagrams, and a changelog, even though its function could be summarized in a single sentence. The question arises, why does this inverse relationship exist so consistently? The answer lies in a mixture of psychological and organizational pressures. One explanation comes from cognitive overload. As a project becomes more complex, the mental effort required just to understand and manage it increases exponentially. This means the people most familiar with the system, those in the best position to write documentation, are often too busy putting out fires, solving interdependent problems, or wrestling with scope creep to write anything down. They may be deep into debugging, integration, or stakeholder management, with no time or energy to reflect on what they've done or how it should be explained. Simpler projects, in contrast, leave more mental bandwidth available for documentation, and they often exist in contexts where thoroughness is encouraged or even required as part of a learning process. There is also the issue of perceived utility. In complex projects, especially those evolving rapidly or being built under tight deadlines, documentation often feels like a secondary concern. Developers and engineers may reason that since the system is changing so frequently, any documentation would be outdated by the time it's written. This leads to a tragic feedback loop. The absence of documentation makes the system harder to understand, which makes it more intimidating to document later, which in turn leaves it undocumented. The deeper this cycle goes, the more true the documentation law becomes. By the time a system is critical and in production, documentation becomes so overdue and difficult that it's almost never completed retroactively. In bureaucratic or academic environments, the law manifests in a different way. Often, complex projects are built through layers of collaboration across teams or institutions, each with their own communication standards. As a result, documentation becomes fragmented, inconsistent, or siloed. Some parts may be well described, while others are known only to a few individuals. In contrast, smaller, grant-funded, or classroom-based projects often come with detailed reports, annotated bibliographies, and clear descriptions of every step, mostly because documentation is a formal requirement of the process. Again, complexity and documentation fail to align, with the most tangled efforts often having the poorest explanatory materials. One of the scientific explanations behind this trend involves the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias wherein individuals with limited knowledge in a domain overestimate their understanding, while experts underestimate theirs. In the context of documentation, novice developers or managers might over-document because they assume that what they've done is worth preserving in detail, or because they are still learning and reflecting. Meanwhile, experts may skip documentation under the assumption that the work is self-evident or too messy to explain properly. This humility, or sometimes cynicism, leads to less writing about systems that actually need the most guidance. Another factor is the visibility and reward structure in many organizations. Writing documentation is rarely celebrated, even though it is crucial. Engineers are praised for delivering features, fixing bugs, or meeting deadlines, not for writing clear, concise documentation. In highly complex projects, the cultural emphasis tends to be on progress and output, not retrospection or knowledge sharing. In simpler projects, especially in educational or collaborative contexts, documentation may be explicitly required and reviewed, leading to a more disciplined approach. As a result, the very projects that could benefit most from solid documentation often get the least of it. In terms of real-life examples, the phenomenon is vividly visible in the software world. Large code bases, such as old operating systems, finance platforms, or embedded systems in aerospace, often have minimal internal documentation, making maintenance extremely difficult. In contrast, open-source projects maintained by small communities frequently come with beautiful, detailed documentation, because these communities depend on accessibility and clarity to attract contributors. Another example lies in government and institutional data systems, where sprawling, decades-old databases may lack schema descriptions or update histories, while newer, simpler tools are rolled out with detailed user manuals and changelogs. The 1999 NASA Mars Climate Orbiter incident is a case that indirectly illustrates the law's implications. The failure was due to a mismatch between metric and imperial units in different parts of the system. The error was rooted in a failure of communication and documentation between teams. While not a one-to-one example of documentation absence, it underscores how large, complex systems can hide fatal assumptions that remain unchecked, precisely because no one thought to document them clearly across interfaces. If such a system had been simpler, perhaps everyone involved would have felt it was worth the time to ensure every detail was documented, ironically, because it would have seemed manageable. In hardware development, the documentation law shows itself when teams must disassemble and reverse engineer their own products to understand previous decisions, often because documentation was skipped in the rush to production. In medicine, complex patient cases involving multiple specialists often lack consolidated notes or case summaries, leading to errors or delays in treatment. Again, the more complex the case, the more fragmented the documentation tends to be. Modern attempts to overcome the documentation law include practices like continuous documentation, where writing and updating documentation is embedded into the workflow itself. Agile development encourages lightweight, living documentation, while tools like code comments inline documentation generators, and collaborative wikis aim to reduce the friction of writing. Yet these methods only succeed when the culture supports and rewards them. Without organizational buy-in, even the best tools cannot override the inertia caused by complexity. Ultimately, the documentation law endures not because people are lazy or negligent, but because humans naturally prioritize action over reflection, especially under pressure. Writing documentation is an act of narrative construction. It requires someone to pause, understand the system holistically, and translate it for others. In the heat of project development, such reflection often feels like a luxury. Paradoxically, the more complex the system, the more it demands this reflection, yet the less likely it is to receive it. That's what gives the law its ironic power. It captures a systemic imbalance between what is needed and what gets done, between complexity and clarity that continues to challenge teams and individuals across fields. The takeaway from the documentation law is not that complexity is doomed to obscurity, but that documentation must be seen not as a postscript, but as an integral part of project design. It must be woven into the process from the beginning, respected as a form of knowledge preservation, and valued not only for others, but for future versions of ourselves. Because someday, someone, perhaps even you, will look back on that tangled, undocumented project and wish that just a little more had been written down. Selden's law, often humorously phrased as the first 90% of the code accounts for the first 90% of the development time. The remaining 10% accounts for the other 90% of the time, is one of those wry, semi-mathematical insights that every software developer intuitively understands but struggles to accept. While its attribution is somewhat murky, the phrase has become widely quoted in programming circles since at least the 1980s and is often confused or conflated with similar sentiments from Tom Cargill at Bell Labs. It doesn't appear in formal computer science literature, but it survives by way of developer folklore, blog posts, programming memes, and engineering retrospectives. The law captures the painful truth that software development is almost never as linear or predictable as project managers hope it will be. Progress appears to move quickly at first, then hits a wall where the remaining small percentage of functionality, refinement, and polish takes exponentially longer than expected. The origin of Selden's law is more anecdotal than academic. It's often grouped with similar engineering aphorisms like Hofstadter's law or Zeno's paradox for projects, where each stage of completion feels further away than it should. While the original coiner of the exact phrase remains elusive, the core idea was floating around in the programming culture of the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in environments like Bell Labs and MIT, where developers began to realize that building a functioning program and building a finished, robust, user-ready piece of software were dramatically different challenges. The first phase, the 90% that seems to go quickly, is often marked by excitement, rapid prototyping, and visible progress. But the last 10% involves edge cases, bugs, performance tuning, cross-platform issues, user feedback, accessibility, error handling, and all the tiny, boring, but absolutely necessary tasks that take forever to get right. Scientifically speaking, Selden's law can be understood through the lens of diminishing returns and the hidden complexity of real-world systems. In the initial stages of software development, goals tend to be clearly defined and broad. Make a working login page, connect to a database, display search results. These tasks can often be completed with frameworks, libraries, or existing code snippets. Developers can string together a minimum viable product, MVP, that works in a controlled setting. But as the scope of the project begins to close in toward launch or handoff, the subtleties come to light. The login page needs two-factor authentication. The database needs security hardening. The search results must be sorted by relevance, respect privacy filters, and paginate correctly. Suddenly, every completed feature starts demanding refinement. Cognitive psychology and project planning methodologies also offer explanations. One reason developers fall into the Selden trap is known as the planning fallacy, a cognitive bias where people underestimate how long tasks will take, even when they've done similar tasks before. The planning fallacy plays directly into Selden's law because developers and managers assume that once the basic architecture is done, the rest will be just cleanup. They underestimate the number of special cases, integrations, and polish needed to make software production ready. In practice, debugging and refining are harder to predict than coding from scratch, and each adjustment can introduce new problems that demand yet more time. This is compounded by the fact that bug fixing, unlike coding, is not a creative process with a clear end. It's often like peeling an onion, where solving one issue reveals several deeper ones. Real-life software projects offer endless confirmation of Selden's law. Nearly every developer has a war story of a feature that was 90% done in 2 days, but took 2 more weeks to actually ship. One famous example is Windows Vista, which took 5 years to develop and was plagued by performance issues, hardware incompatibility, and a bloated codebase. Much of that time was spent trying to complete the final 10%, making it run well across all platforms, smoothing out the user interface, and handling exceptions across a massive ecosystem of hardware. Another illustration comes from the video game industry, where the final months before launch, often called crunch time, are notorious for being when small details and polish dominate the workload. Developers might spend weeks fixing obscure bugs, refining character animations, optimizing frame rates, or dealing with unexpected edge cases, all of which consume massive effort for relatively minor, visible improvement. In agile development environments, Selden's law continues to manifest, albeit in smaller cycles. Scrum teams may complete their sprint backlog on time, but find that what looked like a finished feature requires rework due to QA feedback, integration issues, or ambiguous user requirements. Retrospectives often reflect a shared feeling that the last bit of a task was disproportionately hard. This leads to the realization that done is not always done. A task marked as complete in Jira might not be truly usable, deployable, or stable, which means additional work continues invisibly, pushing timelines further out. Another aspect of Selden's law involves interdependency. Early tasks in a project are often independent and modular. You build a login screen, I build a dashboard. But as development progresses, features begin to depend on each other. Now the dashboard has to reflect the user's authentication status, the profile API must sync with the settings panel, and UI design needs to be consistent across all views. The more tightly coupled the system becomes, the harder it is to change anything without breaking something else. Testing, regression, and continuous integration pipelines start to dominate developer time. This growing fragility of the system contributes to the extended duration of the final stages of development. Some software teams have developed strategies to fight the Selden curve. These include the definition of done principle, which insists that a task isn't complete until it includes tests, documentation, and deployment readiness. Other techniques involve shifting polish and testing earlier in the cycle, such as test-driven development, CI/CD automation, or using feature flags to isolate incomplete code. These approaches help flatten the curve somewhat, but they don't eliminate it. The inherent complexity of human-computer interaction, edge cases, and real-world usage means that surprises always emerge toward the end. Tools can help, but they can't prevent the universe from revealing inconvenient truths late in the game. The philosophical implication of Selden's law is a reminder of humility. It teaches that no matter how smart the team, how elegant the design, or how advanced the tooling, reality has a way of pushing back. Real users will do things developers never imagined. Hardware will behave unexpectedly. Systems that worked fine in development will fall apart under real-world load. The illusion that most of the work is done by the time the code compiles is just that, an illusion. Selden's law is not about incompetence or failure, but about the inherent unpredictability of complex systems and the gap between a thing that works and a thing that's ready for the world. Interestingly, Selden's law echoes principles from other domains. In architecture and construction, the last phase interior work, finishes, inspections often costs more and takes longer than the initial build. In writing, the final 10% editing, rewriting, formatting, and publishing can be more labor-intensive than the draft. The law seems to reflect a universal trait of creative and technical work, that the visible part of progress is only half the battle, and the invisible labor of refinement is what turns something functional into something complete. In closing, Selden's law remains one of the most accurate and frustrating observations in the world of software development. It encapsulates the reality that making software look and behave correctly under all conditions is an exponentially harder task than getting it to work most of the time. It's a law born not in a lab or a textbook, but in thousands of late-night coding sessions, missed deadlines, and lessons learned the hard way. Its humor masks a deep truth that software, like all forms of craftsmanship, demands relentless refinement and patience, especially when we believe we're almost finished. The interview law, often phrased humorously as, "the one question you prepared all night for will not be asked," is one of those universal truisms that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever sat nervously across a table from an interviewer. Though not formally recognized in scientific literature or attributed to a specific individual, the law has become a kind of collective folk wisdom shared among job seekers, students, and professionals preparing for important evaluative situations. It speaks to a fundamental experience in the modern world, the disconnect between our expectations and reality, especially under pressure, and the uncanny way preparation seems to drift just slightly out of alignment with outcomes. The origin of the interview law is difficult to pin down, as it doesn't come from a famous author, academic, or theorist. Rather, it likely emerged organically from the shared frustration of countless interview experiences over the past century. As job interviews became more standardized and widespread with the rise of corporate culture in the 20th century, people naturally began to develop stories, jokes, and observations about their unpredictability. The law may have first taken root as a sarcastic remark between friends or colleagues after a disappointing interview, slowly solidifying into a common saying repeated across forums, books, and coaching sessions. Like Murphy's Law, it survives and spreads because it is instantly relatable and confirmed repeatedly in real-world experiences. From a psychological and scientific standpoint, the interview law has several plausible explanations. One is rooted in the concept of availability bias, which causes people to overemphasize the one question they did prepare for, especially if they invested significant emotional or cognitive effort into that preparation. If that question isn't asked, the sense of loss or anticlimax is disproportionately large, even if the rest of the interview goes smoothly. In other words, our brains are wired to notice the mismatch between expectation and outcome more acutely than they notice congruence. This makes the absence of a prepared-for question feel like a glaring omission, even if the interview still covered relevant ground. Another explanation comes from the idea of spotlight effect and cognitive tunneling. When preparing for an interview, candidates often fixate on a particular topic they feel insecure about or one they believe is critical. They might spend hours rehearsing an answer to a technical question, reviewing obscure theories, or perfecting a personal story. This focus narrows their perception and creates a mental tunnel where everything else fades in importance. When the interview takes an unexpected turn and that question never comes up, the candidate can feel disoriented or betrayed by their own expectations. They may not remember the rest of the conversation clearly, instead remaining preoccupied with the one unused response they had so carefully crafted. There is also a statistical explanation for the law, related to the nature of interview dynamics. Most interviews are short and open-ended, meaning that only a limited number of questions can be asked. If a candidate prepares deeply for one specific question, but the interviewer has a different focus, the chances of overlap are low. This mismatch can occur for many reasons: differing expectations, last-minute changes in interview strategy, subjective impressions of the candidate's background, or even mood. The law emerges not because the universe is cruel or ironic, though it often feels that way, but because human interaction is messy and nonlinear. Real-world examples of the interview law are abundant. A common story shared on job forums involves a candidate preparing intensively for a difficult coding problem or algorithm, only to be asked about system design or behavioral situations instead. Or someone might anticipate tough questions about a gap in their resume, only to find the interviewer skims past it without comment and dwells on a topic the candidate barely reviewed. In academia, PhD students defending their dissertation may rehearse a complex theoretical justification all night, only to be asked about a simple chart or typographical issue. These stories are not merely anecdotes. They reveal a pattern where the time and energy we invest in prediction rarely matches the randomness of human attention. One particularly striking example involved a young lawyer preparing for a law firm interview. She spent hours memorizing case law and preparing arguments for questions related to contract law, which she believed was the firm's focus. On the day of the interview, the partner asked only about her views on office culture, work-life balance, and whether she liked playing golf. None of her legal expertise was touched. Though she got the job, she felt deflated, as if her preparation had been in vain. The experience taught her, as she later said, that interviews are often less about technical competence and more about subjective fit and perceived confidence. Interestingly, the interview law has parallels in other domains. In public speaking, there's a similar phenomenon where speakers rehearse one difficult section extensively, only to find it flows smoothly, while a section they barely thought about causes them to stumble. In academia, students studying for exams frequently report that the one topic they mastered in depth appears only in a minor question or is absent entirely. In military training, recruits are sometimes told, "The battle never goes the way the briefing said," reflecting a broader truth that preparation can only go so far in controlling outcomes. Despite its frustrating nature, the interview law carries an important lesson. Flexibility, presence of mind, and breadth of preparation often matter more than rehearsed precision. Candidates who can think on their feet, adapt their message, and draw connections between their experiences and the interviewer's concerns tend to do better than those who deliver memorized answers. This doesn't mean preparation is useless, far from it. Rather, the best preparation builds a deep understanding of one's own experience, values, and logic, not just a few ideal answers to anticipated questions. It's about building a strong foundation rather than constructing a rigid script. Some career coaches even incorporate the interview law into their advice. They warn clients not to over-rely on anticipated questions and instead practice situational thinking and conversational improvisation. Mock interviews are often designed with curveball questions, not to trip up candidates, but to simulate the feeling of unexpectedness that nearly every interview includes. The law, then, is not a reason to prepare less, but a reason to prepare more broadly and realistically, with humility about how much control one truly has over the process. On a deeper level, the interview law taps into the emotional experience of vulnerability and hope. Preparing for an interview is often an act of aspiration. We want to show our best selves, anticipate what others will value, and control how we are perceived. When the moment finally arrives and takes a different shape than expected, it reminds us that outcomes are not always proportional to effort. The law can feel discouraging at first, but it also reflects a fundamental aspect of life, the need to be ready for the unexpected, to find meaning in the unpredictable, and to stay calm when our plans meet reality. Over time, many people come to embrace the interview law as part of a larger philosophy. They learn that preparation is not a wasted effort, even if the exact question never appears. The act of preparing refines thinking, boosts confidence, and sharpens communication. It builds the mental muscle to respond to whatever does come. And perhaps most importantly, it fosters a sense of self-awareness that often shines through more than any single rehearsed answer ever could. In summary, the interview law is more than just a funny quip about the futility of preparation. It's a window into the chaotic, human side of evaluation, where expectations rarely align perfectly with reality. It reminds us to prepare with depth, not just precision, and to treat unpredictability as the norm rather than the exception. While it may never be included in textbooks or formal methodologies, it lives on in every anxious night before, every curveball question, and every story we tell afterward with a smile and a sigh. Of course, they didn't ask the one thing I prepared all night. As we come to the end of tonight's quiet journey through paradoxes and patterns, remember that these so-called laws aren't just amusing phrases. They're reflections of deeper truths about complexity, uncertainty, and the delightful unpredictability of life. Whether you're preparing for an interview, debugging code late at night, or watching the line next to you move faster, these observations remind us that even in the chaos, there's humor, wisdom, and a shared human experience. We all stumble into Murphy's domain. We all underestimate time, over-prepare for the wrong questions, and find meaning after the fact. Let them be a comfort, not a curse. A reminder that the universe rarely moves in straight lines, and that's okay. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. Until next time, stay curious and sleep well.